This is the second video to talk about models with percents. So if you have not watched the first video, you might want to do that first before we get into this second one. So we have this question's a little different than the ones we saw before. So always we read the whole question first. Mr. Johnson has 75 papers. He graded 60 papers and he had a student teacher grade the rest. What percent of the papers did each person grade? So this one's a little different because we're used to having a percent. So let's think about, first of all, what are we trying to find? What's our answer statement? Well, it says what percent of the paper did each person grade? So our answer statement needs to be Mr. J graded blank percent and student teacher graded blank percent. So he had 75 papers and he graded 60 of those. So now we need to draw our model. So who or what is this about? This is about papers. And what do we know about the papers? Well, we know that Mr. J had 75 papers. Is that part of his papers or was that his total papers? That was his total papers. So I'm just going to draw this across like this. And then I know that these papers equal 75. Then what else do we know about this problem? We know that he graded 60 of them. So is that part or whole? That's a part of the papers. So he graded 60 of them. What would be the other part of the papers? That was what the student teacher had graded. So if he graded 60, how many does that leave for the student teacher to grade? Well, 75 and then 60 of them were graded. That would be 15 of them left to grade for the student teacher. So now I'm thinking about my tape diagram here and how I could break these up into groups. So 60 is definitely more than half and it's almost all. So if this was 60 and then this was 15, how could I break those into equal groups so that I could see what amount was percents? The first thing that kind of sticks out to me is this 15 because I know I could take this 30 and split it, or sorry, 60, split it in half. That would be 30 and 30. So then if I split it in half again, now I have groups of 15 in each box. So now that I have all of the papers, I know that this is the student teacher's part that they graded. And this part here is what Mr. J graded. So now I need to think about percents. Well, I notice this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 equal parts. So which model used 5 equal parts? That was our 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So each of these is worth 20%. So if this is 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, that means that this part is 80%. And the student's teacher's part has to be 20%. That makes sense because that would add up to the 100% of all the papers being graded. So when I answer this, Mr. J graded 80% of the papers and the student teacher graded 20% of the papers. Let's look at this one. Mrs. Crone has graded 20% of her 150 students' papers. How many papers does she still need to finish grading? So our answer statement would be she still needs to grade blank. So at first that sounds pretty simple. Well, she graded 20%. How many does she still need to finish grading? Well, she needs to finish grading 80%. But it's not asking what percent she needs to grade. It says how many papers does she still need to grade. So she still needs to grade blank papers. So who or what is this problem about? Mrs. Crone's papers. And then I just draw my model. This should be like pretty natural now. What do we know about it then? We know that we need to show 20%. So looking at our model, which model would be the best to show 20%? It would be the 5 grid, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So each of these is worth 20%, and it says of her 150 students' papers. So what is that 150? Is that 20% or is that the total? In this case, that is the total. So she has 150 to grade. What she has graded is this part right here, this section. So now I need to use my problem solving and figure out, well, how much is in each of these sections? Well, if I had 150 total papers and I have 5 equal groups that have to make up 150, I see I need to divide this by 50. What could I divide 15? 15 divided by 5 is what? 3. And then a 0 in our question, 0 in our answer. So that means each of these is 30 pages. 30, 60, 90, 120, 150. That does get me to my 150 total papers. This is the part that I need to know about, the 20%, and that would have been 30 papers. She has graded 30 papers already. All right. Let's see if you can solve number 7 and number 8 on your own using answer statements and coming up with models. Remember to look for those percentages and think about what models would be good to mark those percentages. Make sure you're thinking about, is the other information the total or a part that they're describing? Think about what part you need to find. Bring these papers back to class tomorrow.